Sometimes I'll be browsing the Wikipedia pages for games or movies that I like, and occasionally there'll be a drop down labeled Other Media, where you'll find, oh, there's a comic book for this? Okay. Did you know Far Cry 3 has a prequel manga? I didn't until well into starting this script. Well, imagine my shock that the Resistance series, of all things, had not one, but two tie in novels, as well as a six-issue comic book series. The novels are written by William C. Dietz, who most people might know as the guy who wrote the novelization of the original Halo Combat Evolved, titled The Flood. In fact, this is even advertised on the cover of the book that is the subject of this video, The Gathering Storm. It does make sense an author would want to remind you of his most well known work to advertise his newest one, but it is weird to see a product of Xbox on the cover of a product of PlayStation. But I digress. While I've been a fan of the Resistance series since its inception, I never considered the story one of its strong points. The emphasis on cool gun designs with weird alternate fire modes was always the draw for me, and the stories in the games have always felt sort of like an afterthought. Looking at the cover, I assumed the Gathering Storm would take place around the events of the first game, since it uses the same art. However, the book actually takes place in the 2 years between Resistance 2's prologue section and the rest of the game. Already things get a little weird in the continuity because in the game, Dr. Malikov is explaining to our protagonist Nathan Hale what the inhibitor injections are after the 2 year jump.
Yes, Sergeant. Nathan, whatever happens, you must come back for your inhibitor treatment. Do you understand?
Yes, Doctor.
While in the book, Hale talks about taking his routine inhibitor injections as well as an aerosolized inhibitor serum when out on missions. This isn't a knock against the book, if anything, is a knock against the writing of the game. But it is always weird when you have extended media like this and there doesn't seem to be a ton of coordination involved. The blurb on the back also says the events of the book take place in 1952, which is just not correct. Resistance Fall of Man and the prologue of Resistance 2 take place in 1951, while the bulk of Resistance 2's story takes place in 1953. Each chapter of The Gathering Storm conveniently has the exact date at the top, and the events therein take place from November to December of 1951. So I'll chalk up the 1952 on the back to a typo. The somewhat in-between position of the book's events leads to some interesting crossover elements between Resistance 1 and 2 that aren't ever really addressed in the games. For instance, enemies from both games are seen fighting alongside each other. Howlers, which are only ever seen in the first game, appear multiple times, and an angel even makes an appearance. It's actually explicitly stated that Daedalus is a new variant of angel, which goes some way to explaining why there are no other angels by the time of Resistance 2. Meanwhile, chameleons, ravagers, grims, and furies from the second game are also present. Dietz also saw fit to introduce a new Chimera variant called Maulers, who are described as being about 35 feet tall and eject a napalm-like substance from their mouths. Unfortunately, this concept never made it into any of the games, not even Burning Skies, which Dietz himself wrote. There's a similar intermingling of weapons and technology from both games, though the most surprising was the appearance of the Reaper dual carbines and L211 Dragon, which are both weapons the player only has access to in the first game on a second run as a bonus. No mention of the Hailstorm, though, the best weapon in the entire series, which is a shame. We learn why there are changes in the Chimeran conversion process as well. In the original game, spires would be launched that would release crawlers which would enter the human body, infecting them with the Chimeran virus and rendering them comatose so that carriers could ship them off to conversion centers, where they're cocooned until their bodies change into the specific Chimeran variant, after which they'd be given a coolant implant and sent on their way.
Without the cooling apparatus, the hybrids would overheat and die.
Retribution expands on this by explaining that menials perform surgery on the comatose humans to prepare their bodies to receive their coolant implants.
I am not going to end up on some alien butcher block like Bouchard and your brother.
Alright, run, before my better judgment kicks in and I kick your ass!
In the second game, spires would release spinners, which would cocoon people on the spot. Although we never actually see this in action, only the aftermath. In the novel, somehow the spinners determine which variant of chimera a person will become via some unconscious hive mind directive. All that said, we don't learn how the hybrids get their coolant implants after being converted by the spinners. It's explained in the novel that the US released biological weapons that managed to kill off the entire carrier subspecies. and that the introduction of spinners was an adaptive response on the part of the Chimera. It certainly makes more sense than Retribution, where the entire menial and greyjack subspecies are killed off because one guy blew up some conversion centers.
The menials, the greyjacks, every damn one of them's gone. There's no more of us to replace them. The last center I burned out was already abandoned. The Chimera are dead.
It's nice to have some explanation here, as the original game went to great lengths to explain what the Chimera were and how they functioned, almost to make up for the general lack of plot. While the second game's story, while more straightforward, did little to explain why things between the two games were so different. That said, the carrier's only purpose was to carry people.
The Chimeras send in carriers to collect the dormant victims.
Could the hybrids not just load people into one of their big-ass dropships or something?
Get a move, Doctor.
The world we see in the Gathering Storm has a lot more going on than is let on in the games. As the Chimera have more or less wiped out Russia, Asia, Europe, and Canada, they've begun encroaching on American soil, even so far as occupying the city of Chicago, which is probably an improvement over Chicago in real life.
Do you copy?
President Noah Grace, elected into his third term, has put displaced Americans in what he calls protection camps. This is very briefly mentioned in the games, but like many other story elements, it doesn't really affect them at all. Meanwhile, there's a dissident group named Freedom First operating out of the aforementioned occupied Chicago in opposition to the president's newly established police state, though it's never stated how specifically they're opposing the administration other than refusing to be replaced in camps. While the games shy away from referencing real-world events or people, The Gathering Storm makes frequent references to things like Betty Boop or Marilyn Monroe. Dietz even gets a little creative with the alternate history setting by having characters refer to a Bing Crosby movie that doesn't even exist. Characters also make frequent use of real-world tech and weaponry in spite of fictional versions of such things basically being the series' entire reason for existing. It's a lot of small details, but they add up to making the world of Resistance a lot more believable. Whereas the decision to set the series in an alternate timeline where World War II never happened never felt like much more than set dressing in the games, though the manuals tried a bit more in this regard. The actual plot bounces back and forth between the ongoing adventures of Nathan Hale, the protagonist of the first two games, and the in-universe president Noah Grace, and the various conspiracies surrounding his administration. Hale has never had much personality to speak of in the games. In Fall of Man, he barely speaks, and his face only ever displays gruff, tough guy determination, except for that one time he looks a bit sad as some Brits are attacked by crawlers.
Get us the hell out of here!
Anyway, in the second game, he talks all the time, and still only ever displays the same gruff determination, albeit he occasionally ignores orders when he deems it necessary.
I won't hesitate, not even for a second. Offer accepted.
In terms of personality, he's completely outshined by edgelord Grayson from Retribution and psycho-turned-sad sack Capelli in Resistance 3.
Stupid midget.
You want protection? Here.
Here in The Gathering Storm, Hale is still gruff military guy, but he's also humanized a lot more. He actually seems to like his subordinates, and when he does things against the wishes of his commanding officer Blake, he expresses fear of repercussions. He has a hard time sympathizing with civilians who object being put in Grace's internment camps, going so far as to call them whiners, and he even gets laid a couple of times in a couple of surprisingly detailed sex scenes with his former therapist Cassie Aiklin, who canonically looks like the chick from the third Riddick movie, so, nice. We also learn that he grew up in North Dakota and was raised by adoptive parents with an adoptive sister, and spent much of his youth riding horses, so he's definitely more of an actual character here. That said, in capturing footage for this video, none of the context provided by the novel really affected my perception of him in the games at all. At the start of the book, Hale has already joined the Sentinels, a group of soldiers who've been infected with the Chimeran virus, but for some reason have proven resistant to its progression. They actually say the word resistance a lot in the games. It's kind of weird. The virus accelerates their healing ability so that Hale and his comrades recover quickly from injuries, though they can still be killed as easily as any normal human if injured badly enough. Which is certainly in keeping with the experience of playing the second game. It's also made a point that Hale's golden eyes are entirely unique to him. I don't recall it being brought up at any point in Resistance 2 despite being surrounded by other infected soldiers, and it's implied here that Hale's infection is somehow different or more advanced than others. The only time I ever recall it being mentioned in the games themselves is in Parker's assorted voiceovers and occasionally throwaway dialogue from British NPCs in the first game.
It was strange enough that a lone American soldier was walking around a Chimeran conversion center, but it was his eyes that were most disturbing. They showed unmistakable Chimeran traits.
Oi, mate! What's up with your eyes?
Progression of the virus is kept in check by the aforementioned inhibitor injections, which are administered via the spine, although when away on longer assignments, the Sentinels have access to weaker aerosolized inhibitor doses. This never really comes into play in the story of the novel. Hale and his men always have inhibitors on hand, and there's never any point where the supply is low, or someone has to go without for an extended period of time. Although we obviously see the outcome of what happens when you fail to take your medicine in Resistance 2. Throughout the Gathering Storm, Hale goes on a series of missions in which he's tasked with escorting scientists into enemy territory to scavenge Chimeran tech for research purposes. Every time Hale is on a mission, Dietz attempts to raise the stakes, as we know Hale won't get killed off at any point in the book, by having him be accompanied by someone more vulnerable and lacking in combat experience. On his first mission, Hale accompanies a science officer named Nash. They're successful in receiving an object from a downed Chimeran aircraft, but Nash is killed in the process. During his second mission, he's accompanied by Nash's fiancée, and though she survives, she's gravely injured. The tech scavenged in these missions doesn't ever really come into play in the book, but I assume that it provides the means to develop the nuke used at the end of the second game. I guess in this universe, nukes were never properly developed or something. Apparently part of becoming a Sentinel involves being listed as KIA in official records, and they're not allowed any contact with friends or family members. This is very briefly mentioned in Resistance 2.
How did you know about the bomb shelter?
I helped build it last spring. My family lives here, sir. I know about the Code of Zero correspondence, but I had to see them.
Despite this, Hale briefly leaves base on his own to visit his family farm in North Dakota to see if anyone is still alive. Hale finds that his parents have been killed and dumped in a mass grave, and his sister is missing entirely. He also finds 2 children hiding in the barn and endeavors to escort them back to a protection camp. This is the most tense and exciting of Hale's excursions, as unlike his 2 missions to retrieve Chimeran tech, Hale is completely without fellow soldiers or Serpa resources at his disposal. President Grace's contribution to the narrative are completely different in tone and style. Grace and his cabinet are primarily concerned with performing damage control for his image, as his policies have proven unpopular. I suppose locking people indoors because of a virus would prove an unpopular decision to make. The president's end goal is to open up communications with Jordan Shepard, aka Daedalus, to try and convince the Chimera to cease encroaching on American soil, in exchange for basically letting them have the rest of the planet. It's not much of a bargaining position, and when he ultimately does converse with Daedalus, Grace's only means of bargaining is to say, "We will kill lots and lots of Chimera if you don't do what we want." Which doesn't really matter since he's talking about a race of brainless, disposable bugmen. But it leans into the impression that Grace is totally delusional about the nature of the Chimeran threat, even going so far as to attempt these peace talks after a spire lands directly in front of the Lincoln Memorial as he's giving a speech. Along the way, his Secretary of War, Henry Walker, records one of the president's meetings regarding the peace talks and plans to bring the recordings to Freedom First in Chicago, in hopes to have them broadcast on their radio, in the hopes that the president's treasonous actions might spur a revolt from Americans being kept in the protection camps. Walker never actually makes it to Chicago and is taken to an abandoned mine by a small contingent of Chimera who use a human collaborator named Nicole Collins as a means to communicate with their captives. Although the communications all boil down to "don't resist or we'll shoot you." The humans kept down in this mine are basically living in an underground shantytown, and every 3 days the Chimera come to take some of them to what is called a processing center, which we ultimately find out is basically a big nest of spinners where the captives are taken to be cocooned and converted into whatever subspecies of Chimera they're currently in need of. Walker and some of the other humans begin digging escape tunnels under the Chimera's noses, and once complete, a handful of humans actually do manage to escape, although Walker is forced to return to the mine as the Chimera discover the escape tunnel and collapse it. Meanwhile, Hale and the Sentinels have been sent to Chicago to convene with Freedom First on the orders of William Dentweiler, the president's chief of staff, in order to find Walker so he can be tried for treason. Dentweiler tells Serpa and the Sentinels that it's actually Walker who intends to try to broker a truce with Daedalus. Here we actually meet several characters from Freedom First. none of whom are particularly interesting apart from a woman named Spook, who has somehow tamed a howler, which is odd because the idea of a feral chimera isn't formally introduced until the third game. Howlers are extinct by the second game. Furies and Spinners are, at least in the novel, driven by extremely basic mental programming that dictates their behavior. And then there's Grims, which in the games are only ever shown to be mindless zombies. But even here, I guess Dietz realized that made no sense, as the Grims seem to recognize and follow the lead of higher chimera species. How this lone howler wound up tamed is left unexplained though, and maybe it could have been a deliberate foreshadowing of the introduction of feral chimera in 3, but I doubt it. Anyway, the Freedom First people tell Hale that Walker isn't in Chicago, and so he's sent undercover to a Freedom First training facility in Wisconsin, as that's the only other place he could have possibly fled to. Hale's cover is blown when he runs into his sister Susan, who promptly rats him out. This doesn't really have much consequence for Hale, though, as they just verify his story with their people in Chicago, and agree to let Hale go on the basis that the US government knows about their training facility anyway, and killing Hale would probably bring them more trouble than it's worth. It almost feels like a cop-out, but I kind of appreciate not derailing the whole plot so Hale could spend a few more weeks being interrogated or something. You don't usually see a bunch of characters in a narrative all come to a simple, logical conclusion like that, because I guess a story usually has to happen. Hale is then sent to Denver, Colorado, as the entire government has been uprooted and moved there after the Spire attack in Washington. He bangs Cassie again.
Let me ask you something. Sweet like.
And is then assigned to aid the Secret Service in guarding the president, as he gives a speech about how America is awesome, and is totally going to own the Chimera any day now. During the speech, an attempt is made on the president's life by none other than Hale's sister Susan. Nathan stops the attack and his sister is taken into custody. After being allowed one final conversation with Susan, Hale's faith in Grace's administration is shaken for the first time. Shortly after, Blake and Dentweiler introduce Hale to Burl, a guy who escaped the mine where Walker is being held, and a plan is formulated to retrieve Walker at any cost. During the mission, Burl reveals to Hale that the information he's been given about Walker is false, and that it was always President Grace's intention to seek a truce with the Chimera, and that the story that it was Walker's idea was to ensure the cooperation of the Sentinels in hunting him down. Dentweiler grants Hale unlimited funding for the mission, and Hale takes the Sentinels along with several tanks to the mine in Wisconsin where Walker is being held. Unfortunately for Hale and his team, Walker was taken to the Chimera processing facility just the day before. They're able to deduce the location of the facility by noting that there's one building in particular the Chimera are seemingly avoiding firing on. At some point in the commotion of evacuating the humans held prisoner in the mine, Dentweiler either went off on his own or was abducted, because Hale finds him partially converted inside one of the processing facility's spinner cocoons while looking for Walker. Obviously, given how quickly Dentweiler was converted, when they do find Walker, he's much worse for wear. Dietz goes into detail describing how the chemicals in the spinner cocoon seemingly melt a person's features away as they begin their transformation into a chimera. It's a cool, grotesque detail that Resistance 2 never really gets into. We only ever see the cocoons themselves, or they burst open, revealing fully converted Grims. Ultimately, Grace's talks with Daedalus break down when Hale, having retrieved Walker's recordings from his corpse, interjects and kills the president. He never suffers any consequences for this as far as we know. He then tries to take out Daedalus as well, but Daedalus is able to subdue all of the humans in the vicinity with a psychic attack that kills most of them instantly and escapes. I don't think it's ever explained how he's recaptured before the events of Resistance 2, though. On the subject of Daedalus, the book gives a bit more context to his motivations. In the game, we learn he was injected with pure Chimera DNA, but he was quote-unquote immunocompromised, which for some reason turned him into the creature we see him as in Resistance 2. So being a weird psychic, again, quote-unquote, tumor with legs, as Dietz describes him, in an alien hive mind would explain why he commands a big army to some extent, but it doesn't really give much context to why he seems to hate humanity, besides the guy who gave him the injection in the first place, Dr. Malikov. Well, in the Gathering Storm, as part of Grace's plan to attempt communication with the Chimera, Dentweiler abducts Shepard's wife Hannah and tortures her until Daedalus is drawn to her psychically and attempts to rescue her. After which, he's captured and detained by having an implant placed in his body that administers electrical shocks to keep his attention, as he's often psychically wandering, inhabiting the minds of different Chimera across the globe. The implant is also capable of killing him should the need arise, although this obviously fails. Shepard's wife is kept alive and in custody in order to ensure his cooperation. I didn't find any documentation in Resistance 2 that says she dies at any point, so maybe his infection just spread to the point he no longer cared about her being left alive or human. But it does give some insight into why he's so determined to wipe out humanity, I guess. So that's basically the plot of The Gathering Storm. But before I wrap up, I thought I'd mention some other things that I thought were interesting. When it comes to the Chimera's behavior, going back to the human collaborator I briefly mentioned earlier, having played 4 out of 5 of the games and having now finished this book, I'm still unclear as to why the Chimera talk at all. Their nature as a hive mind under psychic command from either the Angels, Daedalus, or the pure Chimera implies, at least to me, that they don't need to communicate with one another. Maybe they receive orders and carry them out as they see fit, but they have a fairly rigid delineation of tasks based on the species of Chimera in question. Like, I don't imagine a steelhead is going to say anything to a titan besides blow something up. The intelligence and behavior of the Chimera also seems to vary from place to place. They're smart enough to do things like use water pumps and drive cars, albeit poorly, as the only Chimera seen driving a human vehicle ultimately crashes it, but then they don't know much about humans themselves, as shown when they drop off supplies to the mine where Walker is being held. To keep their future converts alive, they drop off random garbage, and only very rarely provide actual food. They also will apparently eat people, which explains how they sustain themselves, though it's not stated how they decide which people to eat and which to convert. Another interesting bit of behavior is during the Spire attack on the Lincoln Memorial, the Spinners, which are only ever shown to be mindless bugs in the games, are smart enough to keep one of their victims alive in the hopes that the humans hiding within the memorial will open the gates. Though this plan proves fruitless and they wind up cocooning the guy anyway. Chimera also apparently smell really bad, which makes sense as they are essentially mutated humans who never bathe, and they also apparently shit all over the place. Because of this, throughout the book, the human characters often refer to them as stinks, which is a nickname that never makes it into the games. The secondary functions of the guns in Resistance are used throughout the book, though the weirdest is how the Far Eye sniper rifle's slow motion function is explained as Hale just concentrating really hard. It's also interesting to note that the Chimera in the games only ever use some of the secondary functions of the guns, with 3 even having a menu option to allow the AI to use all of them. Here in the book they routinely use bullseye tags, which I think they only ever do in the second game.
Ladies, who gets the first dance?
Women do get converted in the book, but it's never explicitly stated what subspecies of Chimera they turn into. However, none of the female-specific variants from Retribution ever show up, so we can assume the conversion process just sort of melts away any sexual characteristics.
They're Chimera, all right, but their plumbing's gone, like a menial, except under their knickers. The boilers are gals, not that different from the wife back home. Ugly as shite, and all you hear is constant whining. And if you ignore them, they'll come up and bloody go off on you.
This is worth noting, as Operation Overstrike from Retribution is explicitly mentioned, so other elements of that game being left out is a bit strange. A character in the book sends an email. I guess this is another example of humans reverse engineering Chimeran tech, and it gives a more concrete idea of where the Resistance universe is technologically. Lastly, the book makes mention of a Bullseye Mark III. The first and second game only have the Bullseye Mark I, which is used by the standard hybrids, and Mark II, which is used exclusively by the advanced hybrids. What exactly is different about a Mark III is never explained, and I'm inclined to believe that it's another typo, like the back cover of the book. So, would I recommend this tie-in novel for a game franchise that died with the PS Vita? Honestly, yeah. I was pretty engaged from start to finish. Dietz clearly did his homework by incorporating elements from 3 different games as well as a 6-issue comic book, and injects a lot of personality into a character that, frankly, previously had none to speak of. It's a solid science fiction page-turner, and if anything, being tied to the Resistance name only serves as a hindrance to its potential to appeal to readers. All that said, that's only the first book. There is another. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, let me know what you think in the comments. Have you played the Resistance games? Are you interested in them? Does this book sound like something you read? I will be working on a video for the second book soon. And if you have the same affinity for video game tie-in novels as I do, let me know, because I would like to do more videos like this, and I have quite a collection to work through. Again, thanks for watching, and hopefully you guys will check out the next video that I put out.